Long before candlelight dinners or diamond rings, there were embers in the dark and glances across a stone hearth. In the frozen heart of Ice Age Europe, love, if it even had a name, wasn't spoken. It was carved into silence, one bite of shared meat, one silent watch through the night. No promises, no poetry, just presence. He stayed. She shared. And in those small, consistent acts, a bond was forged stronger than any vow. What if I told you that these unions formed under mammoth bones and starlit skies were more intimate, more loyal, more deeply human than anything we call love today? This isn't just ancient history. It's the origin of connection. The world of the Neanderthal was not a gentle place. It was raw, indifferent, and merciless. There were no cities, no guarantees, no warm homes filled with laughter only, the unyielding cold, predators lurking in the dark, and a relentless battle to survive another day. In this bleak and brutal landscape, survival wasn't just a task, it was a full-time existence. And yet, amidst this daily struggle, something astonishing happened. Relationships took root. Bonds were formed. Not in spite of the hardship, but because of it. You see, Neanderthals didn't have the luxury of spoken language as we do. There were no sweet nothings whispered at dusk, no eloquent vows exchanged by firelight. Their communication was built from the raw elements of shared life gesture, gaze, presence, and touch. A brush of the hand, a shared hunk of roasted meat, a glance that lingered longer than necessary, these were the grammar of their affection. And in this harsh, voiceless world, the first sparks of connection emerged. Not through charm or wit, but through action. Through surviving side by side. Through watching each other's back in the darkness. For them, love was not a feeling you spoke. It was a truth you lived, one gesture at a time. For generations, Neanderthals were caricatured as the dim, grunting cousins of modern man-lumbering, dull-witted, incapable of thought beyond survival. They were the crude footnote to our evolutionary triumph, frozen in the public imagination as beasts who vanished because they lacked what made us human. But that myth is crumbling. In recent decades, science has begun to tell a very different story, one etched not in guesswork but in bone, ash, and artifact. Carefully buried remains have been unearthed, with bodies positioned deliberately, sometimes alongside flowers, pigments, or tools. This wasn't random decay, it was ritual. It was mourning. It was memory. Skeletal evidence shows long-term injuries healed over time, proof that wounded individuals were cared for by others. Food was gathered, wounds were tended, and survival was shared. These weren't behaviors of a cold, indifferent species. These were acts of empathy, of loyalty, of connection, and perhaps most profound of all, evidence of enduring pair bonds. Not fleeting couplings, but long-term partnerships, living, hunting, raising children together. These were not savage beasts, but beings capable of emotional investment, capable of grief, capable of love. It is time we see them not as primitive, but as profoundly human. Imagine trying to win someone's trust, maybe even their heart, without uttering a single word. No compliments. No flirtation. No promises made under moonlight. That was the silent reality of Neanderthal courtship. But silence didn't mean emptiness. It meant action. For Neanderthals, romance was not performed in gestures of poetry or grand declarations. It was survival choreography and unspoken dance, where every move mattered. A male might offer shelter during a violent storm, shielding a potential mate with his body as the winds howled outside their rocky refuge. He might divide his precious portion of a freshly hunted carcass, placing the best cut within her reach without expecting thanks. It was a quiet offering, rich with meaning. And she, in turn, might help clean his wounds with chewed herbs or share the plants she foraged from a hard, frozen landscape. She might sit a little closer during cold nights or share the warmth of her fur wrap. These weren't gestures born from romance novels. They were practical, instinctive, and yet deeply intimate. Over time, repetition built trust. Familiarity became connection. What began as cooperation became companionship. There was no need for words. Every act was a message. I see you. I value you. I choose you. In a world where death was always near, these small offerings were declarations of loyalty. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were the earliest roots of something we now call love. In the unforgiving Ice Age wilderness, survival wasn't a given, it was earned daily. And when it came to choosing a mate, strength undoubtedly mattered. A desirable Neanderthal was someone who could hunt large prey, craft tools from flint and bone, and protect a partner from predators or rival clans. But if you think it was purely brute strength that drew attention, think again. The archaeological record tells a richer story. Among the bones and fire pits, we've uncovered something unexpected: ornamentation. Necklaces made of animal teeth, perforated seashells far from the coast, and stones stained with iron-rich pigments. These weren't accidental decorations. They were carefully crafted and likely worn. But why? In a world where every ounce of energy counted, why invest time in beauty? Because these objects were signals of intelligence, creativity, and social awareness. They showed resourcefulness, but also something more subtle: the ability to think symbolically, to understand status, identity, and expression. In short, charisma. These Neanderthals weren't just strong. They knew how to show who they were, even without language. In the competition for mates, brawn met brains, and something primal stirred in that balance. A decorated hunter wasn't just skilled. He was seen, and in that visibility, he became desirable. Among Neanderthals, as with some primates today, young females likely faced a defining moment at the edge of adolescence: leaving home. Upon reaching maturity, a girl would depart from her birth group not out of rebellion, but necessity. This migration served an evolutionary purpose: preventing inbreeding and strengthening the genetic fabric of future generations. But on a personal level, it was something far more poignant. It was exile in search of belonging. Imagine her world. No map, no promise, just a cold, vast landscape and the instinct to move forward. She would walk away from her mother's care, her siblings' company, the safety of familiarity, into a new clan where no one knew her name or her past. There was no guarantee she would be accepted. She arrived with no protection, no reputation, and no voice in the tribe. Only hope. In that environment, forming a bond wasn't optional, it was survival. Finding a male partner meant more than companionship. It meant warmth through winter, protection from threats, and access to food. But trust had to be earned slowly. A glance across the fire, a shared piece of meat, a space cleared beside a sleeping mat. These small gestures were her lifeline. And yet, this journey also reveals something powerful: female agency. She wasn't bartered or owned. She chose. In the silence of her migration and the vulnerability of her arrival, she became the quiet architect of new alliance-bridging clans, birthing tribes, and shaping the very future of her people. In the brutal world of Ice Age Europe, where each sunrise was a hard-won victory, love wasn't loud, it was quiet, patient, and practical. Early Neanderthal partnerships weren't forged through force or conquest. They weren't trophies won in combat. They were built, gesture by gesture, in the slow rhythm of survival. A male might offer food not as a transaction, but as a sign, "I'll share my strength with you." A female might allow him into her sleeping space not out of submission, but as a signal, "You are safe beside me." These were not dramatic declarations. They were ordinary actions that, repeated daily, formed a pattern. And from that pattern, attachment grew not based on infatuation, but on trust. These relationships didn't erupt. They settled in. He learned her rhythms. She learned his silences. They shared tasks. They anticipated needs. And over time, something more enduring than lust or dominance emerged: partnership. We often romanticize prehistoric life as either savage or solitary, but the fossil record whispers another story. One of shared burdens, of broken bones healed with someone else's care, of firewood gathered not just for warmth, but for someone waiting. This wasn't about survival of the fittest, it was about survival of the most bonded. Because when the winds howled and the world froze, it wasn't just strength that saved them. It was someone staying close, someone staying still, someone choosing not to walk away. In the world of the Neanderthal, there were no fixed roles carved in stone. There were no scripts of gendered expectation handed down by culture. There was only survival, and survival demanded contribution from everyone. Neanderthal women were not confined to the cave, cradling infants by the fire. They were out in the wild, stalking small game, foraging roots and berries through snow, and shaping tools from stone and bone. Their hands bore the same calluses, their muscles the same ache. Men and women worked side by side not out of ideology, but necessity. The Ice Age did not reward dogma. It rewarded adaptability. And in that crucible of cold and scarcity, a remarkable partnership emerged. Each brought strength the other lacked. A man might fell a reindeer, but the woman knew how to preserve the meat. She might craft a fine scraper, while he built the fire that hardened its edge. There was no room for vanity, only value. And yet, in this rhythm of cooperation, something more than function was born: respect. Shared labor meant shared purpose. When they built a shelter, it wasn't his or hers, it was theirs. When a child survived its first winter, it was because both fought to keep it fed, warm, and protected. They didn't just complement each other, they completed each other. Not with words or ceremony, but through action, through showing up, through enduring together. In a world where weakness meant death, they learned the oldest truth of all, that strength, real strength, is never solitary. It is shared. In the stillness of Ice Age nights, beneath firs and firelight, the quiet cries of Neanderthal infants echoed through stone shelters. And from these faint sounds, these fragile beginnings grew one of the most profound stories of human commitment. Fossil evidence and isotope analysis reveal that Neanderthal children were breastfed for nearly a full year and weaned only after 14 months. This was not a species that birthed and abandoned. It was a species that stayed. Such prolonged parental care demanded more than maternal instinct. It required a systemone built on cooperation, trust, and above all, partnership. While the mother nursed and protected, the father became her shield. He brought meat from the hunt. He gathered wood for warmth. He stood between danger and the ones who could not run. His role wasn't symbolic, it was essential. These weren't cold, pragmatic arrangements. They were emotional contracts, signed not with words, but with repetition. with presence, with responsibility. He didn't leave. He leaned in. He carried not just a spear, but the weight of continuity. And what's perhaps most telling, this investment in offspring was not a moment, it was a season. Years passed. Teeth emerged. Tiny footprints padded beside larger ones, and still the bond held. Through famine, migration, illness, and storm. These weren't transactional unions. They were commitments to a future that would outlive them. A lineage carved not into stone, but into bone, blood, and memory. Because in a world where survival was everything, the strongest vow a Neanderthal could make wasn't, "I love you." It was simply, "I will not let you face this alone." Could Neanderthals love? Not in the scripted lines of poetry, nor in candlelit gestures polished by centuries of culture, but in the raw, unyielding conditions of Ice Age life. Love took on a different shape-bone forged in frost, hunger, and silence. Their world did not permit luxury. No sonnets were carved into cave walls. No flowers were pressed into leather-bound pages. But when the winds howled and snow blanketed the earth, love showed itself in the simple act of giving warmth, in the last scrap of dried meat handed not to oneself, but to another, in the decision to stay put beside a sick partner, even when it meant personal risk. Love was the act of not walking away, when walking away would have been easier. A Neanderthal didn't speak love. He proved it. He brought food when he was hungry too. He kept watch while others slept. He wrapped his body around his mate and child, not to be romantic, but to be shelter. She too loved in her way, in her silent tending to wounds, in the gathering of roots for a partner's aching stomach, in the way she murmured low sounds in the dark, calming a frightened infant in a world full of dangers. These were not declarations. They were devotions. Love wasn't a feeling to be celebrated. It was a responsibility to be lived. And maybe, just maybe, that's a purer kind of love than any we write about today. For all the tenderness hidden in Ice Age hearths, the Neanderthal world was no utopia. It was often violent, unforgiving, and deeply competitive. Archaeological sites have yielded skulls cracked by blunt force, bones shattered in combat, and weapons that left unmistakable marks on flesh and stone. Males sometimes fought not over territory or pride but over women, especially in lean times when food was scarce and tribes thinned. Securing a mate became a matter of legacy, and desperation bled into brutality. These were not barroom brawls. These were primal confrontations driven by instinct and biology. Fertile females were rare, and in small bands spread across vast territories, reproductive opportunities were limited. A single woman's decision could alter the genetic fate of a lineage. And so, blood was sometimes spilled beneath the stars. But here's what makes this story more complex and more human. Fossil and genetic patterns don't just show male aggression. They hint at female agency. Women didn't always choose the biggest or loudest. In fact, not every scarred victor became a mate. Some males, despite their brute strength, were bypassed entirely. Perhaps it was because kindness mattered, or reliability, or the ability to cooperate with a group. Whatever the reason, the evidence tells us that Neanderthal females had a say subtle, silent, but powerful. In a world ruled by necessity, they still exercised choice. Even in prehistory, desire was not dictated solely by dominance. It was shaped by discernment. As the last chapters of Neanderthal history unfolded, the world around them began to unravel. The climate shifted, Violently, glaciers advanced, ecosystems collapsed, and food sources became unpredictable. The vast hunting grounds that once fed generations turned barren. And as their numbers dwindled, their isolation deepened. Small bands, once connected by kinship and shared rituals, became cut off geographically, genetically, and emotionally. Inbreeding began to rise, not out of carelessness, but because choices vanished. Birth rates dropped. Infants born into frost-bitten camps faced slim chances of survival. And then came the final blow, the slow, creeping presence of another human species, Homo sapiens. More adaptable, more numerous, and perhaps more socially cohesive, they arrived not with fanfare, but with fire, tools, and language. It was not war that extinguished the Neanderthals. It was erosion. 1,000 small disappearances. And yet, through it all, they didn't descend into chaos. They didn't abandon one another. The fossil record shows something astonishing. Even in decline, they continued to form bonds. A mother still curled around her child. A man was buried beside his partner. They cohabited. They shared meals. They stayed. In a world falling apart, they held to the one thing they could still choose: each other. This wasn't just a species gasping its last. It was a lineage going down with dignity, intimacy, and love. A final flicker in the dark, not of fire, but of loyalty. A quiet refusal to let go of what made them human. And perhaps that's what mattered most. No Neanderthal ever whispered, "I love you." No declarations were carved into cave walls. No songs were sung beside the fire. And yet, what they left behind may speak louder than any language ever could. Across Europe and Western Asia, archaeologists have uncovered remains that tell a quiet, powerful story. A skeleton curled protectively around the fragile bones of a child. Twin bodies buried side by side, facing one another in death as they likely did in life. Tools, not discarded in haste, but worn smooth used for years with the care one gives to something shared. These remnants are not just evidence of existence. They are echoes of emotion, proof of lives lived not alone, but in tandem. Theirs was not a love spoken, it was endured. It was carried in the body, enacted in gesture, and preserved in bone. They didn't write poems. They stayed. Through hunger, through winters, through extinction, and in those silent acts of devotion, we see something hauntingly familiar. A mirror held up to ourselves, not the polished mirror of modern romance, but a cracked, ancient one, where loyalty meant survival and presence was everything. Because at the heart of every bond, whether 40,000 years ago or today, the same truth endures. Love is not made of phrases. It is made of showing up, of sharing your last meal, of holding someone close even when the world is falling apart. Their story did not end in words. It ended in touch, in presence, in legacy. And somehow, that may be the most human thing of all. At Prehistoric Shadows, we don't see the past as lifeless data etched in stone. We see it as a living, memory etched into bone, preserved in ash, and whispered through time. Every scar on a ribcage, every pair of remains buried side by side, every worn-down tool left behind by calloused hands tells a story. A story of longing, of choosing someone in the cold, of reaching out in silence and being met with presence. Neanderthals were not strange, failed experiments of evolution. They were people. People who built shelters not just to shield themselves from wind, but to share warmth. People who didn't write epic poems but chose to stay when it mattered most. Their stories may be buried under millennia of ice and earth, but when you dig deeper, you find something heartbreakingly familiar. They weren't so different from us. They lived, they struggled, they loved, and they left behind more than bone. They left behind a legacy of human resilience that defies extinction. In their unspoken gestures, we glimpse the roots of everything we still hold: sacred, family, connection, loyalty. In a world that often forgets its beginnings, we choose to remember. Because in remembering them, we remember the raw, essential parts of ourselves. If this story stirred something ancient within you, if it reminded you that love once lived in silence, and strength once meant staying, then subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. Here, we don't just tell stories, we resurrect them. We trace the emotional lineage of humanity, bone by bone, soul by soul, because the past doesn't belong in museums. It belongs in our understanding of what it means to be human. Prehistoric Shadows, where the past breathes, where we listen to the bones and hear ourselves.